There is a sound that defines the life they chose. It is not the sound of a cracking helmet or the roar of a sellout crowd. It is not the shrill whistle or the bark of a play call. Those are the sounds of the theater. The real sound, the one that lives in their bones long after the stadium lights go dark, is a silence. A particular, profound silence that arrives the first Monday morning after the final game of your final season. The alarm clock goes off, and there is nowhere to go. The phone does not ring with a schedule. The body aches with its familiar litany of pains. But there is no treatment room to report to, no tape to be applied, no practice to gut through. There is just the quiet of a house that might feel too big, and a future that feels impossibly small. This is the first day of the rest of a life they were never prepared to live. We celebrate their entries. We draft them, we idolize their rookie seasons, we chart their ascents to stardom. And we note their exits. The press conference with the family at the podium, the thank yous, the worn jersey retired to the rafters. We believe we are witnessing a career's end. But we are wrong. For the men inside the uniforms, the true end rarely coincides with that formal goodbye. There is another, more sinister finale that often goes unmarked. It happens in a doctor's office years later, in the confusion of forgetting a route to a familiar place, in the moment a wife looks at the stranger sleeping beside her. It is the end of the person they were before the game took its full payment. I call it the final season. Not the last year they played, but the point of no return where the damage done in the service of our entertainment becomes the permanent condition of their existence. I remember sitting with a man I'll call Marcus Johnson. He asked me not to use his real name. The pride is still there, you see. The shame too. Marcus played 7 seasons as a guard in the late 90s and early 2000s. A reliable, tough, anonymous lineman in the trenches. His job was to inflict violence and absorb it, a human shock absorber. His final NFL game was in December. He walked off the field under his own power. But his final season, he told me, began the following August. He was at a backyard barbecue, surrounded by friends and family. Someone tossed him a can of soda from across the patio. A simple, arcing throw. He saw it coming, raised his hands, and watched it clatter off his fingertips onto the deck. Everyone laughed. He laughed too, a forced, hollow sound. Inside, he was freezing cold. His hands, which had once reacted to 300-pound defensive tackles moving at explosive speeds, could no longer coordinate to catch a soda can. The connection was gone. The wiring was faulty. That was the moment, he said, when he knew the player was truly dead, and what was left was this other man, this occupant of his body, who had to build a new life from the rubble. What is the true cost of a Sunday? We see the spectacular physics of it. The impossible catches, the brutal tackles, the triumph and despair under the bright lights. We are sold a narrative of glory and heartbreak, a clean duality. But there is a third space, a vast and shadowed landscape that exists between those two poles. It is the domain of chronic pain, of cognitive fog, of financial ruin, and of a deep, grieving loss of self. This is the NFL's Darkside. Not the flashpoints of scandal that dominate headlines, but the slow, quiet, systemic grinding down of the human being who is treated, for a time, as more than human. For every iconic highlight that lives forever on film, there is a counterpart that exists only in the private memory of the man who created it. The touchdown catch that separated his shoulder. The game-saving tackle that left a whisper of nerve damage in his neck, a constant static in his limbs. The championship season played on a cocktail of pain-killing injections that allowed a torn muscle to become a shredded, irreversible ruin. They traded these pieces of themselves willingly, joyfully even, for a chance at immortality. But the bargain was obscured. The full terms were never read aloud. The league, an industrial powerhouse built on the most compelling collision sport ever devised, was for decades a master of turning away from the long-term consequences of those collisions. The machine needed its parts to function now. Tomorrow was a problem for the individual, not the institution. So we must ask uncomfortable questions. How much did the architects of this league know, and when did they know it? What does it do to a man's mind to be taught from his teenage years that his greatest virtue is his ability to disregard pain? What is the legacy of a culture that glorifies walking it off, when it is a concussion, a spinal sting, a wrecked knee. We follow these men from the euphoria of draft day to the grim reality of the disability office, from the adulation of thousands to the solitude of a bedroom that's too dark, too quiet. This story is not about the weakness of men. It is about the staggering, often tragic strength required to survive the very thing they loved most. It is an investigation into the gap between the mythology we consume and the human cost we ignore. This is the story of what happens in the silence after the crowd fades. This is the search for the beginning of every player's final season. The National Football League is the most successful sports entertainment product in human history. It is a cultural titan, a weekly religion for millions, a generator of mythologies that define American ambition. But to understand its soul, you must look past the dazzling spectacle. You must examine its engine room. For the majority of its existence, the NFL functioned not as a sports league in the romantic sense, but as a brutal, efficient, and staggeringly profitable industrial complex. Its raw material was the physical talent of young men. Its production line was the field. Its quality control was measured solely in wins and losses. And its waste product, for generations, was the broken human machinery it discarded when it could no longer perform. This documentary is an excavation of that industrial legacy. It is the story of the factory workers who became legends and the profound cost of that transformation. The post-war era saw the NFL's transformation from a regional sports curiosity into a national television powerhouse. The 1958 championship game, dubbed the greatest game ever played, was the catalyst. It was a drama delivered straight into the living room, and the network saw a goldmine. With television revenue came expansion, corporate sponsorship, and an insatiable appetite for product. The product was violent, graceful, compelling physical conflict. And to manufacture it, the league needed a steady, reliable supply of labor. The draft, instituted in 1936, perfected the procurement process. Young men were evaluated, measured, and selected like raw commodities. Their bodies were assets. Their minds were tools to execute complex schemes. Their personalities were often reshaped to fit the needs of the machine. As historian Michael Oriard, a former NFL player himself, noted, the system was designed to produce football players, not to nurture human beings for a 60-year lifespan. The priority was always the next game, the next season. The idea of the whole man was a luxury the industry felt it couldn't afford. Within this system, a specific corrosive culture took root and was weaponized. It was the culture of stoicism. Pain was not an injury to be treated. It was a psychological weakness to be overcome. The phrase "walk it off" was both a command and a creed. This mentality was not an accident. It was an economic necessity. Before free agency, players were bound to their teams indefinitely. There were no guaranteed contracts. Your job security depended entirely on your availability on Sunday. To report an injury was to invite replacement. This created a powerful, perverse incentive for players to hide their suffering, to lie to team doctors, to self-medicate. Hall of Fame linebacker Harry Carson once said, "We were conditioned to believe that if you couldn't play, you were worthless. So you played. You played with concussions, with torn muscles, with fractures. You played because the next guy would, and if he did, he'd take your job." It was a silent pact of mutual self-destruction. This pact was enforced by a medical infrastructure that was, for decades, subservient to the competitive goals of the franchise. Team doctors and trainers were employed by the club. Their primary fiduciary duty was not to the long-term health of the patient, but to the short-term performance of the employee. This conflict of interest was the grease that kept the assembly line moving. It manifested in the widespread, casual distribution of amphetamines, greenies, to mask fatigue and pain. It evolved into the systematic use of potent opioid painkillers and powerful corticosteroid injections, like the infamous Toradol shot, which allowed players to step onto the field numb to injuries that should have sidelined them. The player was not a patient giving informed consent. He was a worker being handed a tool to get his job done. The long-term effects, addiction, organ damage, accelerated arthritis, were his to manage later on his own time and dime. The most devastating industrial secret, however, was the one the league guarded for decades. The catastrophic impact of repetitive head trauma. The NFL's own Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, formed in the 1990s, became a symbol of this institutional denial. While independent scientists began piecing together the link between football and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, the league's hand-picked experts published papers dismissing the risks. They called concussions a pack journalism issue. This was not merely negligence. It was a calculated business decision. To acknowledge the brain as a vulnerable organ was to acknowledge a fundamental flaw in the product itself. It was to risk the entire industrial enterprise. So the machine kept running, and the workers kept colliding, unaware of the time bomb ticking in their skulls. This series will trace the entire life cycle of an NFL player through this industrial lens. We will begin at the very start of the pipeline, on the assembly line of the scouting combine, where young dreams are quantified and commodified. We will explore the company town reality of team control, which extends far beyond the stadium. We will delve into the chemical toolbox of amphetamines and painkillers that kept the production numbers high. We will sit in the meeting rooms where the foremen, the coaches, demanded ever more sacrifice from their disposable parts. We will follow the bitter union battles for basic workers' rights, like free agency and pensions. We will dissect the league's campaign of denial about brain trauma, and we will walk through the grim, bureaucratic scrap heap of the NFL's disability benefits system, where broken men must prove their worth once more, long after the factory has shut them out. We will do this through the voices of the men who lived it. We have spoken to players from the 1960s who were given whiskey at halftime for pain. We have interviewed stars from the 1980s who were handed bags of pills without labels. We have listened to modern veterans who understand the risks yet feel powerless against the same cultural forces. We have also spoken to the widows, the children, the doctors who fought the system, and the journalists who broke the stories the league wished would stay hidden. This is not a simplistic tale of villainy. The players loved their work. They cherished the camaraderie, the competition, the glory. The complexity lies in that very love, which the system exploited so completely. They were willing participants in a glorious grind, but they were never told the full price of admission. This documentary is about that price. It is about the gap between the shimmering product and the human cost of its production. It is about the legacy of an industrial league that built an empire on the backs of men it promised to honor, but often failed to protect. The whistle is blowing. The assembly line is moving. Let us step inside the factory. The journey into the machine begins not on the field of glory, but in a sterile convention center in Indianapolis. The NFL Scouting Combine is publicly presented as a celebration of athletic potential, a thrilling showcase where dreams take measurable form. We see the televised highlights, the staggering 40-yard dash times, the superhuman vertical leaps, the awe-inspiring displays of raw power. It is packaged as the first chapter of a fairy tale. But from the inside, for the young men living it, the combine is something else entirely. It is the dehumanizing first stage of the assembly line, a systematic process designed to strip away individuality, assess biological utility, and initiate a culture of absolute compliance. This is where you stop being a person and start becoming a prospect. I spoke to a former first-round pick, a man who stood on that stage over a decade ago. He described it not with nostalgia, but with the detached clarity of a psychological survivor. You are reduced to a number, he told me. Literally, the tag on your chest. You are poked, prodded, measured in ways that have nothing to do with football. They put their hands on you, they bend your joints, they stare at you like livestock. You stand there in your underwear in front of every coach, every executive, every scout, and you are assessed for flaws. Too short. Knees are suspect. Hands are small. It's a meat market. And you smile through it because you know this is the price of entry. But something shifts in you that week. You learn that your body is not your own. It is a subject of discussion, a commodity to be evaluated. Your personality, your college achievements, your character, none of it matters in those rooms. All that matters is the measurable data you produce and the potential for defects. The physical tests are merely the public facade. The true conditioning happens in the interview rooms. Young men, many barely into their 20s, are grilled under fluorescent lights by cynical football lifers. The questions are designed to probe for weakness, for ego, for any residual individuality that might resist the system's demands. They are asked to diagram plays on whiteboards until they fail. They are subjected to bizarre psychological provocations. One player recounted being asked, "If your mother and your quarterback were drowning, and you could only save one, who would it be?" There is no right answer, only the assessment of how you handle the stress. The process isn't about finding leaders or good men. It is about finding programmable components. Can this young man handle confusion and humiliation without breaking? Will he submit to authority without question? The Combine's unspoken curriculum is the erosion of the self, replaced by a desperate willingness to please the institution holding the pen that signs the check. This psychological dismantling finds its logical extension in the ancient, toxic tradition of rookie hazing. Hazing is often dismissed as harmless fraternity pranks, a bonding ritual. But within the industrial framework of an NFL team, it serves a specific and critical function. It reinforces the assembly line's hierarchy and completes the process of stripping individuality that began in Indianapolis. The rookie is not a new colleague. He is the lowest unit on the production line. His initiation is about enforcing that status. He is forced to carry the pads of veterans, to sing silly songs on command, to fetch food, to pay exorbitant dinner bills. The message is not subtle. You are nothing. Your college stardom is irrelevant. Your identity is now defined by your utility to those above you on the organizational flowchart. Former offensive lineman Joe Staley once spoke candidly about his rookie year, not with anger, but with the analytical tone of someone who understands the mechanism. "It's about breaking you down," he said. "It's about making you so uncomfortable, so eager to belong, that you will do anything to gain the veteran's approval. You surrender your dignity piece by piece. And in that surrender, you learn compliance. You learn that questioning anything, a coaching decision, a practice drill in order to play hurt is unthinkable. Because you've already been conditioned to accept absurd, meaningless humiliation. What's a little pain, a little risk, compared to that? The hazing rituals can cross from the psychological into the physically dangerous. There are stories of rookies being taped to goalposts, forced into ice baths until they risk hypothermia, or subjected to violent, welcome hits in practice that go far beyond competitive intensity. These are not bonding exercises. They are power demonstrations. They establish that your body and your will are not your own. They belong to the team, to the veterans, to the system. By the time the season starts, the transformation is often complete. The unique individual who arrived at the Combine has been systematically broken down. In his place stands a compliant part, numbered and slotted into the machine, conditioned to ignore discomfort, to accept hierarchy without question, and to equate his own worth solely with his functionality on the line. The assembly line has produced its desired product, a worker ready for the factory floor. The whistle blows, production begins, and the next, more brutal phase of control is waiting within the confines of the company town. Once the draft pick is made and the jersey is selected, the real work of institutional assimilation begins. The young man, already stripped of his individuality at the Combine and broken in by rookie hazing, is now absorbed into a system of control that extends far beyond the white lines of the practice field. In the classic era of the NFL, and in many ways persisting today, a player did not merely join a team. He entered a modern-day company town. The franchise owned not just his professional rights, but exerted profound influence over his housing, his finances, his social life, and even his moral conduct. This was not benign oversight. It was a calculated strategy to create total dependency, ensuring the worker's mind and body were solely dedicated to the productivity of the corporate entity. The process began immediately with training camp. For 6 weeks or more, players were sequestered at a remote college campus or a dedicated facility. They slept in dormitory rooms, ate scheduled meals in a cafeteria, and followed a rigid timetable that accounted for every hour from dawn to curfew. This isolation served a dual purpose. It forged bonds through shared suffering, yes, but more critically, it severed the player from his external support systems, family, friends, any influence not sanctioned by the team. His entire world shrank to the boundaries of the camp. His thoughts were meant to be filled with playbooks, film, and the voice of his position coach. This was boot camp for a private army, and the objective was the same: to replace prior identity with unit identity, to instill reflexive obedience to chain of command. This control followed the player out of camp and into the season. For decades, many teams strongly encouraged players, especially younger ones, to live in specific apartment complexes or neighborhoods. Coaches and veterans would often know your landlord. This created a subtle but powerful panopticon effect. Your comings and goings were noticed. Late nights were reported. The team had eyes everywhere. It was a structure designed to minimize distractions, a word that in the company town lexicon could mean anything from a romantic relationship the coaches disapproved of to a business interest that took mental focus away from football. Your life was to be a monastic dedication to your craft, and the team architecture was built to enforce that monkhood. Financial dependency was the most potent lever of control. Before the era of life-altering rookie contracts, most players lived paycheck to paycheck. Their salaries were good, but not generational wealth, and their careers were terrifyingly short. The team held the power to cut you at any moment, voiding your income instantly. This economic sword of Damocles hung over every decision. It made players hesitant to speak up about injuries, about coaching malpractice, about anything that might mark them as a problem. Your financial survival was tied directly to your compliance. Furthermore, teams often involved themselves in players' money matters directly. It was common for coaches or front office executives to steer players toward team-friendly financial advisors, car dealerships, or real estate agents. While sometimes well-intentioned, this practice further ensnared the player in a web of obligations where the line between club assistance and club oversight was dangerously blurred. The policing extended into the personal realm with morality clauses and conduct codes. The company town demanded not just your body, but your reputation. You were a reflection of the brand. This meant your social behavior was subject to scrutiny and sanction. Dating choices, social media posts, political expressions, even the friends you kept could become subjects of discussion in a coach's office. A player from the 1990s told me a story of being summoned by a senior team executive after being seen at a popular nightclub. He didn't yell, the player recalled. He just said, "We invest a lot in you. The people you're seen with, the places you're seen, they reflect on our investment. Make better choices." It wasn't a threat, not explicitly, but it felt like one. I stopped going out. I became paranoid that every car in my neighborhood might be someone from the team checking on me. The message was clear: your private life is not private. It is an extension of company property. The result of this encompassing control was a state of prolonged adolescence for grown men. Decisions were made for them. Schedules were dictated. Problems were handled by the team. This created a specific and crippling dependency. Players were systematically stripped of the basic life skills and executive decision-making that other men their age were developing. They were not taught to manage their lives. They were conditioned to outsource their autonomy to the organization. This explains the profound cliff so many face upon retirement. The infrastructure vanishes overnight. There is no one to tell you where to be, what to do, how to structure your day, how to manage your relationships. The company town has evaporated, and you are left standing alone in a landscape you were never prepared to navigate. You have been a highly paid, highly celebrated dependent, and the transition to true independence is a brutal shock. The infantilization was a feature, not a bug, of the system. A dependent worker is a compliant worker, and a compliant worker does not question the methods of the foreman, even when those methods involve the chemical tools required to keep the machinery running at maximum brutal output. The factory floor of the NFL was, and remains, a place of constant brutal impact. The machine demanded maximum output from its human components, but those components were flesh and blood, subject to fatigue, pain, and the natural limits of endurance. So the system developed tools to circumvent those limits. The first and most culturally entrenched was not a therapy or a treatment. It was a chemical override. For generations, the widespread, open use of amphetamines, known universally in locker rooms as greenies, was the dirty secret hiding in plain sight. They were not an illicit underground substance. They were a standard piece of equipment, as commonplace as tape and cleats. Their purpose was industrial efficiency, to suppress the body's warning signals, to mask pain, to generate artificial energy, and to keep damaged workers on the assembly line for one more shift, and then another and another. To understand the greenie's role, you must first understand the physical reality of a season. The NFL schedule is a uniquely savage gauntlet. The violence of a Sunday game leaves bodies deeply bruised, muscles torn, joints inflamed, and brains concussed. In the era before advanced sports science, the recovery period between games was not nearly enough for genuine healing. Players reported to Tuesday meetings feeling wrecked, moving with the stiff gait of much older men. By Wednesday and Thursday practices, the pain was a constant thrum, a background noise that made focus difficult and explosive movement agony. This is where the greenie entered the ecosystem. A former offensive lineman from the 1970s described the ritual to me with chilling normalcy. They'd be in a bowl in the training room, he said. Little green pills. You'd grab one or two on your way to the practice field. Within 20 minutes, you didn't feel tired. You didn't feel sore. You felt invincible. You could run through a wall. And that was the point. You could practice at full speed on a body that was, in truth, broken. The administration was rarely covert. Trainers and team doctors distributed them. Veterans showed rookies the routine. Coaches, while perhaps not directly handing them out, created an environment where their use was not just accepted but expected. The cultural pressure was immense. If you were not taking the pill that allowed you to practice with the required intensity, you were letting down the unit. You were failing to answer the bell. The greenie erased the gap between what your body could actually do and what the job demanded it do. It turned injured men into temporary superheroes, masking damage that was often compounding beneath the chemical veil. A player might take them to get through a Wednesday practice with a high ankle sprain, then again on Thursday, then a larger dose on Sunday to play through it. The injury never healed. It was merely silenced, often leading to a more severe, career-altering tear. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical. Amphetamines are powerful stimulants. They create hyper-alertness, agitation, and a dangerous sense of invulnerability. They alter mood and judgment. The same drug that allowed a linebacker to fly around the practice field with abandon could also fuel irrational anger, paranoia, and a crash of depressive exhaustion once the chemical left the system. The locker room culture of the era, often portrayed as raucous and volatile, was undoubtedly shaped by this ubiquitous chemical influence. Players were literally pharmacologically altered for work, and those alterations did not simply switch off when they left the facility. They carried the edgy, artificial energy home to their families. They tried to sleep through the chemical aftermath. They became dependent on the substance not just for performance, but to simply feel normal or to access the aggressive persona required for their job. Perhaps the most damning aspect of the greenie era was the complete absence of informed consent. Players were not presented with medical data about the risks of amphetamine abuse, the potential for heart damage, psychological dependency, or the dangerous interaction with underlying injuries. They were not patients. They were workers being given a tool by the company mechanics. The message was clear. This will help you do your job. The unspoken corollary was just as clear. If you refuse the tool, someone else will take it and they will take your job. The league, of course, turned a blind eye. There was no testing, no policy, no educational outreach. The machine needed its parts to function. The greenie was the lubricant that kept the gears grinding, even as those gears were wearing down to dust. The legacy of the greenie era is not just a historical footnote about a reckless bygone time. It established the fundamental template for the NFL's relationship with chemistry. It normalized the idea that a player's natural physical state was an obstacle to production, one that should be chemically corrected. It created a workforce conditioned to seek a pill for a problem, to distrust their own pain signals, and to believe that artificial enhancement was a professional responsibility. When the league finally banned amphetamines and instituted drug testing, the underlying demand of the machine did not change. The body still needed to perform beyond its limits. The pain still needed to be silenced. The factory simply required a new, more sophisticated and medically sanctioned toolkit. The greeny bowl in the training room was emptied, but in its place, a new, more potent and legally complex chemical regimen would be established. One wearing the white coat of a team physician and carrying the promise of a pain-free, and ultimately more dangerous, performance. The whistle hangs from the neck of every man who has ever stood on an NFL sideline with a clipboard. But in the industrial league, that whistle was not merely a tool to stop and start play. It was the foreman's signal, the audible command of a manager whose sole KPI was production. And no foreman cast a longer, more imposing shadow over the entire factory than Vincent Thomas Lombardi. His legacy is one of towering triumph, etched in championships and immortalized in the name on the Super Bowl trophy. He is celebrated as the paragon of leadership, discipline, and success. But within the walls of the machine, the Lombardi model represented something more complex and far darker. The institutionalization of relentless psychological pressure, the glorification of human disposability, and the ultimate prioritization of the product over the person. He did not invent this ethos, but he perfected it, and in doing so, provided the blueprint for generations of foremen to come. Lombardi's famous credo, "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing," was not a motivational slogan. It was an operating principle for a ruthless industrial process. His practices were not simply hard. They were psychologically and physically obliterating. He believed in breaking men down to their fundamental components, stripping away ego and individual thought, and rebuilding them as interchangeable, obedient parts of a single, relentless machine. Perfection was the standard on every drill, every play, every repetition. Failure to meet that standard was met not with instruction, but with withering, personal, and public humiliation. A dropped pass or a missed block was not a mistake. It was a character flaw, a betrayal of the unit. This created an atmosphere of pervasive fear. Fear of failure, fear of the coach's wrath, and most potently, fear of being replaced. This is where the industrial metaphor becomes concrete. Under Lombardi, and under the many coaches who molded themselves in his image, players were not athletes. They were parts. And a part that malfunctioned or wore out was to be discarded without sentiment. There was no loyalty to the veteran, no gratitude for past service. If a younger, cheaper, or more durable part could be slotted into the machine to maintain or increase production, the switch was made. This reality was the steel fist inside the velvet glove of team-first rhetoric. The Green Bay Packers were not a team of 11 men. One of his former players told me, his voice still carrying the weight of that time. We were a system, and Coach Lombardi was the system's engineer. You either fit the specification exactly, or you were scrap metal. You knew it. Every single day you knew it. It made you tough, sure, but it also made you feel expendable. Even when you were winning, the psychological pressure was engineered to forge a specific type of mental hardness, but its collateral damage was immense. Players lived in a state of constant anxiety. They played through severe injuries not just out of personal pride, but out of terror that their replacement would seize their job forever. The foreman's whistle demanded everything, and the culture ensured that to withhold anything. A torn muscle, a concussion, a personal crisis was an act of sabotage. The human needs of the individual were viewed as weaknesses that compromised the integrity of the product. This mindset filtered down from the head coach through his assistants, creating a layered system of management where each position coach was a shop foreman, responsible for the output and compliance of his specific unit. The legacy of this model is a double-edged sword. It built dynasties. It created an archetype of the tough, no-nonsense leader that fans and owners romanticize. But it also institutionalized a form of sanctioned abuse. The screaming tirades, the personal insults, the physical intimidation, all were justified under the sacred umbrella of building champions. It conditioned players, the workforce, to accept treatment that would be unlawful in any other profession. It taught them that dignity was a luxury they could not afford. The emotional scarring for many was as permanent as the physical scars. A player from the 1980s, who played for a Lombardi disciple, confessed, "I dream about his voice, not in a good way. I'm 50 years old, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I'm about to be chewed out for a protection scheme I missed in 1987. He lives in my head. That's not coaching. That's psychological ownership." The tragedy of the Lombardi model is that its undeniable success, the wins, the titles, became the ultimate validation of its methods. It proved that treating men as disposable components could yield spectacular industrial output. For decades thereafter, coaches who employed gentler, more human-centric methods were viewed as weak, as poor foremen unable to extract maximum production. The blueprint was set: dominance through fear, success through disposability, and a wall of separation between the architect of the machine and the human cost of its operation. This left the workers, the players, with a stark realization. If the foreman saw them as replaceable parts, and the company town controlled their lives, their only hope for leverage, for some measure of protection, lay in collective action. They would have to unionize, not against the game they loved, but against the industrial machine that consumed them. The whistle of the foreman was law. The company town enforced control, and the greenies kept the assembly line humming. For the worker within this machine, the path to any semblance of power or protection seemed impossible. They were individuals negotiating against a monolithic corporation that owned their rights, their labor, and often, their futures. Their only potential leverage was collective action. The history of the National Football League Players Association is not a tidy story of progressive triumph. It is a brutal, bloody, and often failed series of battles fought on an uneven field, a story of men risking everything: their careers, their friendships, their legacies, for the most basic of workplace rights: a fair share of revenue, a safe pension, and the freedom to choose where they worked. This was the fight on the union floor, and it revealed the machine's most unforgiving nature when its control was challenged. In the beginning, the union was little more than a polite suggestion box. For decades, players had no representation, no collective bargaining agreement, no agent to negotiate their contracts. They were handed a standard contract by team owners on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. It bound them to their team in perpetuity through the option clause and the Roselle rule, which effectively made free agency non-existent. If you played out your contract and wanted to move, your new team had to compensate your old one with players, cash, or draft picks, a price so steep it prevented movement entirely. You were property. Your only choice was to play for your assigned franchise or not play at all. The first real shots in this war were fired not on a picket line, but in a courtroom. The catalyst was John Mackey, the charismatic Hall of Fame tight end for the Baltimore Colts. In 1970, Mackey became the first president of a newly reconstituted and militant NFLPA. The owners, led by Commissioner Pete Rozelle, refused to recognize the union or bargain in good faith. So Mackey and a group of players did the unthinkable. They sued the league. Mackey v. NFL challenged the very system that bound players to teams forever. The legal battle was grueling and personally costly. Mackey was blackballed. His post-career opportunities dried up by owners who saw him as a traitor to the game. But in 1976, they won. The court struck down the Roselle rule, calling it an unreasonable restraint of trade. It was a landmark victory, the first crack in the owner's absolute control. But the personal cost was a warning to every player who followed. Challenge the machine, and it will grind you up. The victory in court did not translate to immediate power. The owners were masters of stalling, of creating sham agreements, of waiting for player unity to fracture under the pressure of short careers and individual fear. This led to the strikes of 1982 and 1987. The 87 strike is the one etched in infamy. The players walked out after week 2, demanding true free agency. The owners' response was a stark display of the industrial mindset. They deployed replacement players, scabs, to keep the product on the field. For 3 weeks, stadiums hosted what fans derisively called spare bowls, featuring amateur players and desperate veterans who crossed the picket lines. The sight of those games breaking the solidarity of the union was a psychological dagger. The strike collapsed. Players returned, defeated and divided, having gained almost nothing. The message was reinforced. You are not irreplaceable. the machine can find other parts. The true turning point came not from a strike, but from another lawsuit. In 1993, after years of failed negotiation, a federal jury ruled in favor of Packers defensive end Reggie White and a class of plaintiffs in White v. NFL. This decision forced the system that exists today, a salary cap and, crucially, true free agency after a certain number of seasons. It was the union's greatest victory. Finally, a player could have some control over his career, his destiny, and his earning power. It created the modern era of player wealth and movement. But even this victory had a dark, unspoken clause. The fight had been so focused on economic freedom, on revenue splits and signing bonuses, that other fundamental rights were left on the bargaining room floor. Player safety was a bargaining chip, not a sacred principle. The union, in its desperate need to secure financial gains for its members, repeatedly traded away stronger health and safety protections. More rigorous off-season workout limits could be conceded. Stricter concussion protocols? That could cost us a percentage point of revenue. The owners were brilliant at this calculus. Offer more money upfront in exchange for maintaining control over the working conditions. The result was that generations of players won the right to get rich, while the system retained its right to break them. The pension and disability plan remained a labyrinthine, underfunded nightmare, a fight for another day. The union had won a seat at the table, but the table was in a room where the air was still thick with the implicit understanding that the product, the game, the industrial output could not be fundamentally altered. They had won a measure of control over their bank accounts, but not over their bodies. And for those bodies, now more valuable than ever, the machine had a newer, more sophisticated, and more devastating set of chemical tools ready for deployment. The victories on the union floor secured the paycheck. They did not, however, alter the fundamental physics of the workplace. The collisions remained just as violent, the wear and tear just as cumulative. With free agency and soaring salaries, the players became more valuable assets than ever, but the timeline for return on that investment became even more brutally short. A team signing a star to a massive contract needed him on the field. Now, this economic pressure fused with the old culture of stoicism and created a new, more medically sanctioned paradigm. The Greenie Bowl was gone, banned by the league. In its place arose a sophisticated, systematic, and chillingly routine pharmacological protocol. This was no longer about pep pills. This was about industrial-strength pain management. The tool of choice was no longer a simple stimulant. It was a torque wrench, used to forcibly tighten a damaged component so it could bear one more week of load. The tools had names: Toradol, Vicodin, Percocet, corticosteroid injections. And their purpose was singular: to separate a player's consciousness from his injured body, to allow the machine to keep running. The ritual became as standardized as a pre-game warm-up. I've heard the same story from players spanning the 1990s to the 2010s. It's described with a chilling mundanity. Toradol Tuesday, or The Shot, was a weekly event. Players would line up in the training room, often half-dressed, and receive an intramuscular injection of the powerful non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug ketorolac, known by its brand name Toradol. It wasn't a targeted treatment. It was a systemic numbing agent. It didn't heal a sprained ankle or a torn labrum. It shut off the body's ability to feel the inflammation and pain from those injuries. One former defensive back described it to me. You'd get the shot in your backside, and within an hour you felt clean, empty of pain. You could run, cut, hit, and feel nothing. It was like playing a video game. Your body was just an avatar. The connection was severed. The problem, of course, is that pain exists for a reason. It is a warning signal. Toradol allowed players to ignore catastrophic structural damage, to play on high-grade ligament tears that would then shred into complete ruptures, transforming a 6-week injury into a career-ending one. The Toradol shot was the broad-spectrum solution. For more specific, localized damage, there was the needle. Corticosteroid injections, powerful anti-inflammatories like cortisone, were fired directly into aching joints and torn muscles. The goal was the same: reduce inflammation and pain immediately to allow performance. The long-term consequences were devastating. These injections can weaken tendons and cartilage, making them more prone to rupture. They accelerate the degeneration of joints. A player might get a series of shots in a knee to finish a season, only to find that knee is bone on bone by the time he's 35, requiring a replacement that should have come decades later. The shot was a short-term loan against the body's future, with usurious interest. And then there were the pills, the opioid pipeline. Team doctors dispensed powerful narcotic painkillers like Vicodin and Percocet with a casualness that defies belief. They were handed out in bulk, often in unlabeled bottles after games and practices. A player from the early 2000s told me, "They'd give you a Ziploc bag with maybe 30-40 pills in it after a game. Just white tablets. No prescription info, no instructions. Take 1 or 2 for pain. That was it. This was the maintenance program. The Toradol shot got you through the violence of the game. The opioids got you through the agony of the following days so you could practice again, so you could do it all over again the next Sunday." The cycle created physical dependency and addiction before many players even understood what was happening. They were not drug seekers. They were injured employees following the medical protocol provided by company doctors. The system had medicalized the process of ignoring injury, wrapping it in the white coat of authority, making it seem safe, responsible, even professional. The informed consent was a fiction. Players were rarely, if ever, sat down and told, "This injection will mask the pain of a tear that, if you aggravate, will end your career." Or, "These pills are highly addictive opioids, and your body will become dependent on them." The dialogue was transactional. "You hurt." "Yeah, my knee's killing me." "Okay, we'll get you a shot. You'll be fine for Sunday." The player's yes was given under duress. The duress of wanting to play, of fearing his job, of not wanting to let his teammates down. The entire medical apparatus was aligned with the competitive goal, not the Hippocratic Oath. The team doctor worked for the team. The trainer worked for the team. Their success was measured by the number of healthy bodies on the practice field, not by the long-term wellness of those bodies a decade later. This systematic chemical management created a generation of players who entered retirement not just with battered bodies, but with a chemical dependency they had to overcome. The machine had used the most advanced tools of modern medicine not to heal them, but to exploit them more efficiently. It allowed the league to maintain the violent spectacle while outsourcing the human wreckage to the future. But there was one injury the Toradol couldn't touch, one pain the opioids couldn't silence. It was the injury happening in the silent, dark space inside the helmet. While the players were numb to the musculoskeletal damage, their brains were being scrambled with every hit, every snap. The painkillers were a chemical curtain, drawn across the visible musculoskeletal wreckage of the game. They allowed the league and its players to focus on what they could see and temporarily fix. But behind that curtain, in the one organ that could not be numbed by Toradol or silenced by Vicodin, a silent catastrophe was unfolding. For the better part of a century, the National Football League managed its most fundamental industrial hazard not with protocol, but with language. They minimized it, sanitized it, wrapped it in the folksy, harmless jargon of the trade. A concussion was not a traumatic brain injury. It was getting your bell rung. It was seeing stars. It was a dinger. The language was purposeful. It framed the event as temporary, minor, and part of the job's rough charm. A quick shake of the head and you were back in the huddle. This was not an accident. It was the cornerstone of a deliberate, decades-long institutional campaign to deny, deflect, and discredit the mounting scientific evidence that the core activity of their sport was causing chronic, progressive, and fatal brain disease. The turning point, the moment the league transitioned from passive ignorance to active denial, came in 1994. Facing growing media questions and the first trickle of concerned independent research, the NFL did what large industries often do when confronting an existential threat to their product. They formed a committee. The Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, headed by a New York rheumatologist named Dr. Elliot Pellman, was presented as a serious scientific inquiry. In reality, it functioned as a sophisticated public relations firewall. For over a decade, this NFL-funded committee published a series of papers in the league's own journal, Neurosurgery. Their conclusions were a consistent and comforting refrain for the owners and fans. Concussions in NFL players were minor, transient events with no long-term consequences. One of their most infamous studies, published in 2003, concluded that NFL players have evolved to a state where their ability to sustain blows to the head without injury is superior to that of the general population. They were, in essence, claiming the workforce had industrially adapted to the hazard. The committee's work was not science. It was obfuscation dressed in a lab coat. They designed flawed studies with tiny sample sizes. They dismissed or attacked independent researchers who found contrary evidence. Most egregiously, they maintained for years that a player could not suffer a second concussion while still recovering from a first, a dangerous fallacy that put countless men at risk. The message funneled down to team doctors and trainers was clear. Concussions were not a serious issue. The league's own experts said so. This created a medical culture within teams where players were routinely and rapidly returned to play. The concussion test was often a series of simple questions on the sideline. Who are we playing? What's the score? What's the weather? If you could slur an answer, you were cleared. The imperative was to get the valuable part back onto the assembly line. I have spoken to players from this era who now understand the gravity of what was done to them. One, a former special teams ace, recounted a game where he made a tackle and his vision went dark for several seconds. He staggered to the sideline. The trainer asked me how many fingers he was holding up. I guessed right. He said, "You got your bell rung. Take a breather." 2 series later, I was back on kick coverage. I played the rest of the game with a headache so bad I was seeing trails of light. But according to the protocol, I was fine. The league's science said I was fine. This was the human consequence of the denial. Men were walking back into collisions with brains that were physically and metabolically vulnerable, stacking injury upon injury, each one lowering the threshold for the next. The league's campaign extended beyond its committee. They used their immense influence to marginalize legitimate scientists. When Dr. Bennett Omalu, a neuropathologist in Pittsburgh, discovered abnormal tau protein in the brain of Hall of Fame lineman Mike Webster in 2002, a condition he named chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the MTBI committee and legal line doctors launched a fierce effort to discredit him. They demanded retractions. They questioned his credentials. They tried to bury his findings in a wave of bureaucratic and scientific intimidation. They did not engage with his evidence. They sought to destroy the messenger. This was the industrial complex in its most defensive mode, protecting the brand at all costs, even if the cost was the truth about the men who built it. The term concussion protocol implies a system of care, a structured response to a known medical event. For the NFL, until forced by lawsuits and public outcry, the protocol was a performance. It was a script of denial written by a league-sponsored committee, enacted by team personnel who feared contradicting the league line, and performed by players who had been culturally conditioned to believe that a brain injury was a test of toughness. The goal was not diagnosis and recovery. It was rapid return to play. The tragedy is that the men in charge likely knew, or willfully avoided knowing, the terrible truth. Internal memos and emails that later emerged in litigation would reveal executives discussing the dangers years before the public admissions. But the machine could not afford to acknowledge a flaw in its central violent mechanism. So they lied. They lied in scientific journals. They lied to players. They lied to fans. And in doing so, they sent an entire generation of men onto the field as unwitting participants in a long-term neurological experiment, the results of which would only be discovered in their middle age, in their confusion, in their rage, and in their graves. The story of this denial is best understood not through committee reports, but through the life and death of one man, the very first broken prototype whose brain told the story the league refused to hear. The system we have described, the assembly line, the company town, the chemical toolbox, the foreman's pressure, the union's narrow victories, and the medical denial is an abstract framework. It is a blueprint of neglect. But to understand its true human consequence, you must see that blueprint etched into a single life. You must follow the arc of one man from the pinnacle of the profession to its most devastating depths. No story illustrates the total systemic failure of the Industrial League more completely than that of Mike Webster. His biography is not merely tragic. It is a forensic map of how the machine consumed a man, piece by piece, and then discarded the hollowed-out remainder. He was the broken prototype, the first man whose suffering would become undeniable scientific evidence. Mike Webster entered the league in 1974, a classic product of the system. He was a center, an offensive lineman from the University of Wisconsin, drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was tough, intelligent, and relentless. He perfectly embodied the Lombardi ethic that defined the Steelers of the 1970s. He played through pain, through injury, through exhaustion. He was the Iron Man, starting a then-record 177 consecutive games. He snapped the ball to Terry Bradshaw for 4 Super Bowl victories. He was a 6-time All-Pro, a Hall of Famer. He was, by every outward metric, a flawless product of the NFL's golden age. He had given his body to the machine, and the machine had rewarded him with glory, respect, and a legacy. His career ended in 1990 after a final season with the Kansas City Chiefs. And then the system's support vanished. The decline was precipitous and horrifying. The man known as Iron Mike began to rust from the inside out. The cognitive and psychological symptoms emerged first. He became moody, irritable, prone to violent outbursts followed by profound depression. He struggled with simple decision-making. His memory fragmented. He could not hold a job or manage his finances. The physical symptoms were equally brutal. Chronic pain from years of untreated injuries, arthritis so severe he could barely move, and a desperate, deteriorating attempt at self-medication. He was sometimes homeless, sleeping in the train station in Pittsburgh or in his pickup truck. He used a taser gun on his own body to incapacitate himself long enough to fall asleep through the pain. He lost his family, his home, his stability. The football hero had become a ghost, wandering the streets of the city that once cheered him. The institutions that had profited from his labor were nowhere to be found. The NFL's disability and pension system, a labyrinth he was never prepared to navigate, became his next opponent. His applications for disability benefits were denied repeatedly. The league's doctors argued his disabilities were not football-related. They pointed to possible mental illness, to personal failures, to anything but the obvious, glaring truth. That 17 years of repeated cranial collisions in the heart of the Steeler offensive line had broken his brain. The union he had paid dues to for nearly 2 decades offered little effective help against the league's bureaucratic fortress. The company town had evaporated, leaving him alone in the cold. He became a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the NFL, a pathetic coda for a champion, fighting in court for the medical care he should have been given as a right. Then, in 2002, Mike Webster died of a heart attack at age 50. His body was donated to science. A young forensic pathologist in Pittsburgh, Dr. Bennett Omalu, examined his brain. What he found would change everything, and yet, for Webster, it was too late. Under the microscope, Omalu saw a brain that was atrophied, scarred, and tangled with an abnormal protein called tau. It was a pattern previously seen in boxers with punch-drunk syndrome, but never before documented in a football player. Omalu diagnosed chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Mike Webster's mind had not been lost to personal weakness or mysterious illness. It had been systematically damaged, play by play, snap by snap, concussion by undiagnosed concussion. His erratic behavior, his dementia, his pain, it was all the direct result of his work. His brain was the smoking gun. He was not a flawed man. He was a poisoned one. The industrial process had left a definitive biological residue. Webster's posthumous diagnosis made him the index case, patient zero for the NFL's CTE crisis. Every systemic failure converged in his story. The culture that demanded he play through head trauma, the medical staff that likely missed or minimized his concussions, the league that denied the connection for years, the pension system that abandoned him, and the final, grotesque irony that his broken brain became the most valuable piece of evidence against the very system that created it. He was the canary in the coal mine, and his death was an unambiguous warning of a pervasive, lethal gas filling the tunnels of professional football. His life after football was not an anomaly. It was a prophecy, and it forced upon the league a question it could no longer evade through committees or jargon. If this could happen to Iron Mike Webster, what was happening to all the others? The answer would not be found in the glory of the highlight films, but in the grim, bureaucratic trenches of the league's own disability board, where broken men were forced to plead for the compensation they were owed, often with brains too damaged to navigate the process. The football field is an arena of definitive outcomes. A A score is a score. A win is a win. The lines are clear, the rules are known, and the effort is visibly connected to the result. But when the career ends and the broken worker approaches the institution for the compensation he was promised, he enters a different kind of arena. One with no clear lines, with shifting rules, and where his lifetime of effort is met not with gratitude, but with skepticism. This is the NFL's disability benefits system. It is not a safety net. It is a labyrinthine adversarial assembly line of its own, one designed not to distribute care, but to process claims with a primary objective of denial. It is where the industrial complex's final transaction takes place. The conversion of human suffering into bureaucratic obstruction. The process begins with a simple, devastating realization. I cannot work. I cannot function. The body that was my fortune is now my prison. The mind that once memorized complex playbooks now struggles to remember a grocery list. So the former player, often with the help of a spouse or a dwindling support network, turns to the plan he paid into throughout his career. The NFL Player Disability and Neurocognitive Benefit Plan. The name is a masterpiece of corporate obfuscation, promising help with clinical coldness. The reality is a gauntlet. The application itself is a small novel of medical history, financial disclosure, and personal testimony. It requires documenting every injury, every treatment, every job attempted and failed since football. For a man with cognitive impairments or one struggling with the daily agony of chronic pain, this task is Herculean. It is the first filter, designed to weed out those without the fortitude or mental capacity to even begin the fight. His application is reviewed not by an independent medical board, but by the NFL's retirement board. This board is composed of an equal number of representatives from the league and the players' union. The conflict of interest is structural and profound. The league's representatives have a fiduciary duty to protect the financial interests of the plan, which is funded by the owners. Every dollar awarded in disability is a dollar that does not return to the owner's pockets. The union representatives are meant to advocate for the player, but they are often outgunned by league-hired doctors and attorneys who specialize in defending the plan's coffers. The player is not a client. He is a claimant. And from the outset, the system is weighted against him. The central and most cruel hurdle is the burden of proof. The player must prove with objective medical evidence that his disability is both total and permanent, and that it is a direct result of his NFL employment. This sounds reasonable until you apply it to the kinds of injuries football creates. Proving a knee is destroyed is straightforward. An MRI shows the shredded ligaments and absent cartilage. But how do you objectively prove the cognitive fog of CTE in a living patient? How do you prove that the depression and mood swings are the direct result of brain trauma and not some pre-existing condition or personal failing? The plan's doctors, who have never treated the player, routinely second-guess the diagnoses of the treating physicians who have. They dismiss subjective complaints of pain, of memory loss, of psychological anguish. They parse language with devastating precision. A man may be deemed disabled from any job requiring physical labor, but not from sedentary work. The fact that he has a 10th grade education and no skills beyond football is deemed irrelevant. The fact that his chronic pain prevents him from sitting at a desk for 8 hours is dismissed as exaggeration. I have read denial letters sent to former players. They are masterclasses in bureaucratic brutality. They cite a single sentence from a 4-hour neuropsychological evaluation to claim the player is malingering. They latch onto a decades-old minor car accident as a more likely cause of brain injury than 10,000 professional football collisions. They suggest that the player's documented arthritis could be managed with over-the-counter medication, ignoring the testimony of 3 surgeons who said joint replacement is inevitable. The goal is not to understand the totality of the man's ruin. It is to find a single loophole, a single contradiction, a single missing document that justifies sending him back to the start of the line. The appeals process is a purgatory designed to break the spirit. It can take years. It requires hiring lawyers and medical experts, costs that a man with no income can scarcely afford. The mental toll is catastrophic. A former player's wife told me, "The process was worse than the injury. At least the pain was something we could face together. The disability fight, it made him feel like a criminal. like he was trying to steal something. They made him defend his own brokenness over and over. By the end, he just gave up. It was easier to be poor and broken than to be humiliated one more time. This is the final industrial logic. The machine extracted value. The broken part is removed. The cost of its disposal is to be minimized. The disability assembly line is the quality control checkpoint that ensures only the most catastrophically, undeniably ruined pass through to receive support. It protects the league's treasury and its narrative. Every denied claim is a data point that can be used to suggest the problem is smaller than it is. Every player who gives up in exhaustion disappears from the statistics. The message is the same one delivered on the field, but in legalese instead of a coach's scream, you are disposable. Your suffering is an actuarial variable, not a human tragedy. And as the line of broken men grew longer, as the science of CTE became irrefutable, the public began to see the grotesque spectacle of millionaire owners and a multi-billion-dollar league fighting in court against the men who built it. This transparent injustice, however, relied on a simple, cold economic fact. For every broken veteran who could no longer perform, there was a long line of eager, healthy, and ignorant young men ready to take his place, no matter the warnings now echoing from the scrapyard. The disability assembly line operates on a simple, cruel economic principle. A cost is only a crisis if there is no way to avoid paying it. For the NFL, the suffering of its veterans was long viewed as a manageable expense, a line item that could be minimized through bureaucratic delay and denial. But this strategy relied on a deeper, more fundamental reality that insulated the entire industry from true accountability. It was the reality of the endless, eager, replaceable supply. For every broken veteran shuffling through the disability maze, there were thousands of young men dreaming of taking his place. They were lined up at the factory gate, year after year, generation after generation. Their bodies whole, their minds sharp, their ambition blinding them to the wreckage of those who came before. This is the engine that powered the machine's indifference, the perpetual, renewable human resource. They were the replacements. Consider the view from the bottom. Every fall, over 1 million young men play high school football. About 70,000 play in college. 254 are drafted. The math is a funnel of ruthless Darwinian logic. The dream is so potent, the glory so intoxicating, that the odds become part of the romance. This endless churn of talent creates a permanent buyer's market for violence and skill. A team does not need to carefully nurture a 30-year-old veteran with a bad knee and a cloudy memory. Not when there is a 22-year-old rookie, fresh from the collegiate assembly line, with a clean bill of health, a cheaper contract, and a burning desire to prove he belongs. The veteran's knowledge and experience are valued, but they are not priceless. They are often outweighed by the simple, devastating arithmetic of a younger body. This reality fundamentally shaped the psychology of the workplace. Every veteran knew it. You felt it in training camp when the new draft pick playing your position took reps with the first team. You saw it in the eyes of the coaches when they discussed getting younger. Your career was a race against the depreciation of your own physical capital. It created an environment where you dared not show weakness, because standing right behind you was not just one replacement, but an entire system designed to produce them. A former running back told me, "You'd be in the cold tub, aching everywhere, and you'd watch the rookies running drills, so fast, so explosive, and you didn't feel envy. You felt fear. You knew that your value was draining out of you with every ache, and their value was increasing with every rep. You were a depreciating asset. They were appreciating assets. The team's financial logic was clear, even if no one said it out loud. The process of replacement is not a singular event. It is a constant, low-grade pressure. It is the undrafted free agent sleeping on a teammate's couch, willing to play for the league minimum, willing to do anything for a spot. It is the practice squad player, a human insurance policy, studying your playbook, waiting for you to falter. The system is designed to make every man feel provisional. There is no tenure. The collective bargaining agreement, won through such strife, ensures free agency and money, but it does not and cannot guarantee security. Your job is perpetually insecure. This insecurity is the lubricant that keeps the machine running smoothly. It ensures compliance. It ensures that players will accept the painkiller injections, will hide the concussions, will submit to the foreman's demands. The alternative is not just unemployment. It is being erased, replaced by a newer model before your time is even up. For the broken veteran, watching this cycle continue is a particular kind of hell. It confirms his worst fear, that he was never indispensable, that the machine did not pause when it broke him. It simply slotted in a new part and kept producing the Sunday spectacle. His suffering is invisible to the fan cheering for the new star wearing his old number. The institutional memory is short. The league moves on with breathtaking speed. The history it sells is one of legends and highlights, not of the human aftermath. The replacements become the starters, who then become the veterans, who then, if they are not careful or lucky, become the broken men fighting for disability. The cycle is a closed loop, a wheel that grinds without sentiment. This is why the league could resist change for so long. The economic model was too perfect. The supply chain of talent was too robust. The public's appetite for the product was too great. As long as the pipeline of willing young men remained full, the system could externalize its long-term costs onto individuals and their families. The replacements guaranteed that no single player's tragedy, no matter how stark, could halt production. Mike Webster's story was a horror, but it was treated as an outlier, a sad anomaly, not a systemic symptom. The league could point to the thousands of former players who were ostensibly fine, ignoring the hundreds who were not, because for every broken man who spoke out, there were a dozen healthy ones in the broadcast booth or the corporate suite providing a counter-narrative. But a system that relies on silence and ignorance contains the seeds of its own exposure. It only works if everyone plays their part. The player in denying pain, the doctor in masking it, the coach in exploiting it, and the league in dismissing its consequences. What happens when someone in that chain refuses? What happens when a doctor, trained to heal, looks at the broken men and decides his loyalty is to medicine, not to the brand? What happens when a researcher stumbles upon a truth so dangerous that the league's entire denial architecture threatens to collapse? The replacements kept the machine running, but they could not stop the truth from leaking out. That truth would be carried by a different kind of replacement. Not a player, but a pathologist. Not a company man, but a whistleblower holding a microscope slide that contained the image of Mike Webster's ruined brain. The league's narrative was a fortress, built over decades. Its walls were made of dismissive language, its battlements manned by league-funded scientists, and its gatekeepers were a sports media ecosystem often reluctant to bite the hand that fed it. The story inside the fortress was simple and reassuring. Football is tough, injuries are part of it, and the league cares for its own. But a fortress, no matter how strong, is vulnerable to those who speak a truth it cannot absorb. The siege of the NFL's denial did not come from an army, but from a scattered, unconnected group of individuals. A pathologist, a journalist, and the families of broken men. They were the whistleblowers. They had no power, no platform, and everything to lose. And they changed everything. The first crack in the wall appeared in Pittsburgh, in the office of Dr. Bennett Omalu. He was an outsider in every sense. A Nigerian-born forensic pathologist, not a sports medicine specialist. When he autopsied Mike Webster in 2002, he was driven not by agenda, but by scientific curiosity. The brain looked wrong. He stained it, peered through his microscope, and saw the tangled tau proteins of CTE. His discovery was met not with celebration, but with fury from the football establishment. The NFL's Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, led by Dr. Elliot Pellman, wrote a formal letter to the journal Neurosurgery demanding a retraction of Omalu's paper. They attacked his methodology, his credentials, his very understanding of the disease. It was a classic institutional intimidation tactic. Omalu described the pressure to me, his voice still carrying the weight of that isolation. They tried to bury me. They said I was practicing voodoo. I was not anti-football. I was pro-truth. But when you tell a multi-billion-dollar industry that its fundamental product is poisoning its workers, you become the enemy. I feared for my career. I feared they would destroy me. While Omalu fought the medical battle, the story needed a messenger to break it out of scientific journals and into the public consciousness. That messenger was Alan Schwartz, an investigative reporter for the New York Times. In 2007, Schwartz began publishing a series of articles that meticulously connected the dots Omalu had uncovered. He tracked down other broken players, like former Eagles defensive back Andre Waters, who had died by suicide and was later found to have CTE. He exposed the flimsy science of the NFL's committee. He gave voice to the families. Schwartz's work was methodical, relentless, and impossible to dismiss. He was not a sports columnist writing about games. He was an investigative journalist writing about an industrial scandal. The league could not bully the New York Times as it had bullied Omalu. Schwartz's reporting turned a medical curiosity into a front-page crisis, forcing the issue onto the league's doorstep and into the halls of Congress. But the most powerful and most heartbreaking whistleblowers were not doctors or journalists. They were the wives, the children, the parents. They were the ones who lived with the aftermath daily, who watched vibrant men deteriorate into shadows. They became amateur neurologists, caregivers, and eventually activists. Pam Webster, Mike's ex-wife, fought for his disability benefits long after their marriage ended, becoming an expert in the league's bureaucratic maze. Tia McNeil, the sister of late linebacker Ronald McKinnon, became a vocal advocate after seeing her brother's decline. These women, and dozens like them, formed a network of shared grief and furious determination. They swapped information, supported each other through legal battles, and stood before cameras to tell stories the league wanted forgotten. They faced immense social pressure. Football is a religion in many communities. To criticize it is to commit a kind of sacrilege. Families were accused of being bitter, of seeking money, of tarnishing a hero's legacy. One widow told me, people would say, "He knew what he signed up for," or, "You enjoyed the money and the fame, now you have to deal with this." As if we were greedy. We weren't asking for a parade. We were asking for acknowledgement. We were asking for help. And we were asking that it not happen to other families. Their love for the men they lost was weaponized against them. Yet they persisted. They donated their loved ones' brains to science. They testified before Congress. They turned private grief into public testimony. The league's response to this chorus of whistleblowers followed a predictable corporate crisis playbook. First, attack the source. Second, commission internal studies to buy time. Third, when the evidence becomes overwhelming, settle to make the problem go away. They moved from denying Omalu to grudgingly funding more research to finally facing a class action lawsuit from thousands of former players. The whistleblowers, through sheer, stubborn truth-telling, had successfully put the National Football League on trial. Not in the court of public opinion, but in an actual federal courtroom. The discovery process of that lawsuit would rip the lid off the fortress, revealing the internal memos and emails that showed what the league knew, and when it knew it. The battle was no longer about medical journals or newspaper articles. It was about liability, discovery, and the staggering cost of a century of denial. The question was no longer if the league was responsible, but how much it would cost them to escape a judgment that could threaten the very foundation of the industrial complex. The machine had no quality control for the brain. It measured 40-yard dash times, bench press reps, vertical leaps. It had protocols for sprained ankles and pulled hamstrings. But for the organ that housed the consciousness of the worker, the seat of his identity and his future, there was no inspection, no maintenance schedule, no warranty. The damage accumulated silently, a hidden defect in the product of a player's labor. Then, in a coroner's office in Pittsburgh in 2002, a quality control report was finally issued. It was not generated by the league's engineering department. It was produced by a curious doctor looking at a stained slide under a microscope. The subject of the report was Mike Webster's brain. The finding was catastrophic failure. This was the moment the hidden cost of production could no longer be ignored, because for the first time, it had been rendered visible, tangible, and scientifically unambiguous. Dr. Bennett Omalu did not set out to investigate football. He was a forensic pathologist for Allegheny County. His job was to determine cause of death. When Mike Webster's body arrived, the immediate cause was a heart attack. But Omalu was struck by the trajectory of Webster's life, from icon to destitution. He suspected the brain might hold answers. When he removed it, he noted it appeared normal externally. But when he sectioned it, stained the tissue, and placed it under his microscope, he entered uncharted territory. What he saw were brown, tangled clusters where they should not have been. A healthy neuron is a clean, filamentous structure. What Omalu saw in Webster's brain was a forest of neurons strangled by a toxic protein called tau. It was a pattern he recognized from medical literature on boxers with dementia pugilistica and from a condition called Alzheimer's disease, but this was different. It was concentrated in the folds of the frontal and temporal lobes, the areas that govern judgment, impulse control, emotion, and memory, the very functions that had abandoned Mike Webster in life. Omalu gave this pathology a name: chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Chronic, meaning long-term; traumatic, meaning caused by injury; encephalopathy, meaning disease of the brain. It was a straightforward, descriptive diagnosis. He published his findings in the journal Neurosurgery in 2005. In his mind, he was sounding an alarm, doing his duty as a physician. He expected the NFL's medical establishment to engage, to be concerned, to perhaps launch a major study. What he received instead was a declaration of war. The league's Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, the very group tasked with studying such injuries, wrote a scathing letter to the journal demanding a retraction. They attacked Omalu's science, his interpretation, his very right to make the diagnosis. Dr. Elliot Pellman, the committee chair, famously dismissed the findings, saying a single case study proved nothing. The message was clear. This outsider, this interloper, would not be allowed to redefine the risks of the game. But Omalu was not deterred. He had seen the truth in the tissue. He began reaching out to the families of other deceased players who had exhibited similar symptoms. One by one, the brains arrived. Former Pittsburgh Steelers guard Terry Long, who died by suicide at 45. Philadelphia Eagles defensive back Andre Waters, who died by suicide at 44. Each brain told the same story under the microscope. The tangled tau, the atrophied tissue, the biological signature of repeated trauma. This was no longer a single, anomalous quality control report. This was a pattern, a systemic manufacturing defect. Omalu, along with colleagues at the Boston University CTE Center that would soon form, was building a damning dossier. The broken prototype, Mike Webster, was not unique. He was the first identified unit in a production run of thousands that likely carried the same flaw. The league's strategy shifted from outright attack to a campaign of confusion and containment. They funded their own studies, which continued to downplay the risks. They used semantic arguments, claiming a distinction between concussions and subconcussive hits, as if the brain cared about the branding of the trauma. They pointed to the thousands of former players who were ostensibly healthy, using the absence of a diagnosis in the living as proof that the problem was rare. But Omalu's work had opened a floodgate. Independent journalists, most notably Alan Schwartz of the New York Times, began connecting the dots between the suicides, the early-onset dementias, and the emerging science. The story was no longer confined to medical journals. It was on the front page. It was in congressional hearings. The quality control report was being read into the public record. The most devastating aspect of Omalu's discovery was its implicit accusation. CTE is not caused by a single massive hit. It is the result of the accumulation of thousands of smaller, routine collisions, the very stuff of football, the daily grind of the assembly line. This meant the problem was not a matter of dirty plays or faulty equipment alone. It was inherent to the job description. The quality control report indicted the fundamental process. You could not have industrial-grade football without industrial-grade brain trauma. The league had built its empire on a foundation it now had to admit was quite literally mind-destroying. Omalu's microscope had not just found a disease. It had found the ghost in the machine, the unavoidable byproduct of the spectacle. And with that evidence now public, the workers, past and present, had the foundation for something they had never truly possessed. A massive, unified legal claim against their employer for knowingly putting them in harm's way. The science was the evidence. The lawsuit would be the invoice. It was the disability denial process writ large, with billions of dollars at stake. The discovery phase was where the fortress walls began to crack. The plaintiff's attorneys demanded internal NFL documents. What emerged was a paper trail of profound negligence. Memos from the 1990s showed league executives discussing the need for more brain trauma research while their own committee was publishing dismissive studies. Minutes from meetings revealed a focus on public perception over player protection. Perhaps most damning were the actuarial reports commissioned by the league that projected stunning rates of early-onset dementia among former players. Reports that were filed away even as the league publicly claimed more research was needed. This was not a case of the league being behind the science. It was a case of the league looking at the warning signs and choosing, for business reasons, to look away. The narrative of ignorance collapsed under the weight of its own internal documents. Facing a potential trial that would air this evidence before the world, and the existential threat of a jury verdict that could reach into the tens of billions, the league did what large corporations do. It sought a settlement. The negotiation was a brutal affair. On one side, plaintiffs' attorneys represent men with deteriorating brains, desperate for care and support. On the other hand, NFL lawyers representing owners are determined to cap their liability and avoid any admission of guilt. The result, after years of back and forth and judicial scrutiny, was an uncapped settlement fund initially valued at $765 million. Later revised to likely exceed $1 billion. On paper, it was a staggering sum. In practice, it was a meticulously crafted corporate resolution. The settlement established a complex matrix of compensation. It categorized neurological conditions like ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and dementia. It set monetary awards for each, with higher levels for more severe impairment. Crucially, it included death with CTE, a category for men who had died and were posthumously diagnosed. This was the league's de facto acknowledgement of the disease, though the legal language still stopped short of admitting causation. But the fine print contained the real devil. The settlement created a monetary award grid with strict eligibility criteria. A player's diagnosis had to be made by a court-approved physician. His years of play had to meet a minimum threshold. The burden of proof remained on the claimant and his family. The process was still adversarial, just within a new, league-funded bureaucracy. Many players and advocates saw the settlement as a betrayal. It bypassed a trial that would have forced the league's executives and doctors to testify under oath. It prevented a definitive legal finding of liability. It capped the league's financial exposure, turning a potential open-ended catastrophe into a managed, budgeted expense. Most insultingly to some, it included a race-norming adjustment in the neuropsychological testing that made it harder for black players to qualify for awards, a provision that sparked outrage and later revision. A prominent plaintiff's attorney who was critical of the final deal told me, "It was a masterpiece of risk management. The league bought global peace. They turned a question of right and wrong into a question of accounting. The victims got money, some much needed. But the history books will record a settlement, not a verdict." The league ensured its narrative survived, even in defeat. The settlement did, undeniably, provide crucial financial lifelines to thousands of families. It established baseline care for men who had been abandoned. But its legacy is one of ambiguous resolution. The NFL protected its business model without a full airing of its transgressions. The players received compensation, but not the catharsis of a public vindication. The litigation era ended not with a bang, but with a wire transfer and a stack of claim forms. It proved the players could hurt the league's wallet, but it did not fundamentally alter the power dynamic. The machine had paid a massive tort claim, a cost of doing business, and with that cost now quantified and contained, the league turned its attention to the future. The question became, having been forced to pay for the sins of the past, would the NFL genuinely reform the game for the future? Or would the new safety protocols be merely another layer of public relations, a way to reassure the next generation of replacements and their families that the factory was now safe? The battle moved from the laboratory and the newspaper to the one arena where the National Football League could not control the narrative: the federal courtroom. For decades, the league had managed its crises through public relations, internal committees, and the sheer force of its cultural might. But the discovery of CTE, and the thousands of broken lives it explained, created something new: a plaintiff class. Not just a few disgruntled former employees, but an army of them, all alleging the same fundamental harm. The litigation that began in the early 2010s was not a simple lawsuit. It was a class action siege, an unprecedented legal battle that sought to make the league financially accountable for the neurological damage suffered by its workforce. This was the reckoning, not in the court of public opinion, but in a place where testimony was given under oath and documents could be compelled. The goal was not just compensation, but an admission, through the cold language of a settlement, that the machine had broken its workers in ways it had long denied. The cases consolidated in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania under Judge Anita Brody. The plaintiffs' lawyers argued a simple, powerful case, that the NFL had known for decades of the link between football and long-term brain injury, that it had actively concealed that information from players, and that it had promoted a culture of violence while failing to enact reasonable safety measures. The league's defense was a multifaceted fortress. They argued the claims were preempted by the collective bargaining agreement, a technical move to shunt the issue into a weaker private arbitration system. They argued the players had assumed the risks inherent in the game. They hired battalions of expert witnesses to challenge the science of CTE and to argue that the players' conditions could be attributed to other causes: lifestyle, genetics, pre-existing conditions. The settlement was a line drawn in the ledger, a massive financial transfer from the past to the present. It addressed, however imperfectly, the debts owed to broken men. But it did not answer the urgent question about the future. Could the machine be reformed? Could the NFL, facing undeniable science and massive liability, redesign its assembly line to be safer, or would the changes be merely cosmetic, new paint on the same brutal machinery? In the years since the concussion crisis exploded, the league has undertaken the most comprehensive safety overhaul in its history. There is a new vocabulary: the concussion protocol, the guardian caps, the targeting rule, the independent neurological consultant. The public relations message is one of evolution, of a game adapting to modern science. But from inside, the view is more complicated. The question isn't whether things have changed. They have dramatically. The question is whether the fundamental power dynamic, the industrial logic that treats the player's body as capital to be invested and spent, has truly shifted or simply been refined. The changes are tangible and significant. The concussion protocol is now a detailed, step-by-step process. When a player shows any sign of disorientation, he is removed from the game and taken to a medical tent. He is examined by an independent doctor, unaffiliated with the team, who has the unilateral authority to rule him out. This is a radical departure from the days of how many fingers? The protocol includes a graded return to participation process, mandating rest and gradual exertion. The rules themselves have been rewritten to punish dangerous hits. Targeting with the helmet, launching at a defenseless receiver, hits on quarterbacks below the knee. All now draw immediate flags, fines, and sometimes suspensions. Equipment has evolved, with advanced helmet testing and the introduction of softshell guardian caps for practices. The league points to data showing a reduction in diagnosed concussions, and they are almost certainly correct. The factory floor, in a physical sense, is less overtly hazardous than it was 20 years ago. But culture and economics are harder to redesign than rules. The protocol is only as strong as the willingness to follow it. And that willingness exists in tension with the same old pressures. A player in the medical tent knows his backup is taking his reps. A star facing a crucial third down play knows the team needs him. The independent doctor may have authority, but he still operates within the ecosystem of the game with coaches, general managers, and owners who have massive investments in player availability. The protocol manages the crisis of a visible head injury. It does nothing to address the thousands of subconcussive hits, the routine play-by-play collisions in the trenches, that the science suggests are the true engine of CTE. We have medicalized the extreme event, but the fundamental, repetitive violence of the job remains. The rule changes, while well-intentioned, have created their own perverse incentives and criticisms. Defensive players argue the game has been sanitized, that the speed and violence are what make it compelling, and that they are now forced to tackle in anatomically impossible ways, leading to different kinds of injuries. The league finds itself in an impossible bind. It must make the game appear safer to placate parents, insurers, and courts, while maintaining the essential violence that is its product's core appeal. The result can feel like theater. A brutal helmet-to-helmet hit that draws a flag is still a brutal helmet-to-helmet hit. The penalty may punish the offender, but it does not unring the neurological bell for the recipient. The spectacle is now accompanied by a performance of safety, the officials conferring, the replay official in New York reviewing for ejection, but the fundamental collision economy continues. Economically, the player is still a depreciating asset, only now more expensive than ever. The massive, fully guaranteed contracts for quarterbacks are the exception, not the rule. For most players, their contracts are not guarantees, but options the team can void at the first sign of decline. The franchise tag still binds a player to a team against his will. The collective bargaining agreement, negotiated by the union, still trades health and safety concessions for immediate financial gains. The most recent CBA added a 17th regular season game, increasing the wear and tear on players' bodies because the television revenue was too lucrative to refuse. This is the clearest signal that the industrial logic is unchanged. The machine's output, games, ratings, revenue is still the paramount concern. Player health is a variable to be managed, not a principle to be prioritized. So, is it a safer assembly line? Technically, yes. There are more guardrails, better safety inspections, and improved emergency shutdown procedures. But is it a different kind of factory? I do not believe so. The relationship between capital and labor remains fundamentally the same. The league has become more sophisticated in its risk management. It has incorporated safety protocols as a necessary cost of doing business in the post-litigation era, much like a chemical plant installs scrubbers after an environmental lawsuit. The goal is to reduce the most glaring harms and the associated liabilities, to make the product socially sustainable for another generation of consumers and workers. But the product is still human collision. The worker's body is still the raw material, and the ultimate goal is still to extract maximum value from that body during its brief window of peak performance. The new machinery is more elegant, more computerized, and better at public relations. But it still produces the same essential thing, and it still grinds down the human parts that fuel it. The proof of this is not found in the press releases from Park Avenue, but in the lived reality of the men who have passed through the system and now exist in its shadow, in the scrapyard of retired lives, where the final cost of the new and improved machine is ultimately paid. The roar does not fade gradually. It ends with the sharp, final click of a locker closing for the last time. One day you are in the center of a universe of noise, obligation, and purpose. Next, you are in the silence of your own kitchen, with nothing but the ringing in your ears and the ache in your joints to keep you company. This is the scrapyard. It is not a physical place, though you might find its inhabitants gathering in quiet corners of Florida or Arizona, in hospital waiting rooms, or in the online support groups that glow on phones in the dead of night. It is a state of being. It is the long aftermath, where the bonds forged in fire are tested by the slow, cold drip of time, and where every man is left to conduct his own private audit of a life spent in the machine. I have spent time in this scrapyard. I have sat in living rooms where the furniture is arranged to accommodate a stiff walk, where the bathroom cabinet looks like a pharmacy shelf. I have listened to men who once communicated in complex play call terminology, now struggle to find the word for remote control. The physical toll is a universal language. They compare surgeries like metals, the knee replacements, the spinal fusions, the reconstructed shoulders. They talk about pain not as an event, but as a weather system, a constant low-pressure front in their lives. A former linebacker describes his morning ritual: a hot shower to loosen the rust, followed by the careful, piece-by-piece assembly of his body for the day, each movement a calculated negotiation with yesterday's damage. You don't get out of bed, he tells me. You build yourself out of bed every single morning. But the deeper wound, the one less easily shown, is the loss of identity. For 20 or 30 years, your name was fused with your function. You were a guard, a safety, a quarterback. You were a stealer, a cowboy, a patriot. That identity provided structure, status, and a clear reason for being. In the scrapyard, that identity is stripped away, and what lies beneath can be terrifyingly fragile. The transition to former player is a journey into obscurity. The world has moved on. The machine has new parts. The applause that once felt like oxygen is now just a memory, and the silence it leaves behind is deafening. This psychic shock is why the brotherhood formed in the company town becomes a lifeline. They call each other, they check in, they speak a language only they understand, referencing coaches long dead and games long forgotten. This fellowship is real, profound, and often the only thing that keeps men from disappearing entirely into their own private struggles. Yet, even this brotherhood cannot solve the neurological isolation. CTE and its precursors do not just cause memory loss. They fracture personality. I have spoken to wives who describe the man they married slowly being replaced by a stranger. Angrier, more paranoid, emotionally flat, or uncontrollably volatile. The brother can recognize the struggle, but he cannot cross the blood-brain barrier to pull his friend back. The scrapyard, therefore, is also a place of profound loneliness, even in a crowd of teammates. You are alone with your ringing ears, your aching joints, and your scrambled thoughts. The shared language eventually fails when the very organ that processes language is under siege. And so we arrive at the unbearable, essential question that hangs over every gathering, every painful morning, every confused afternoon. Was it worth it? I have asked this question. The answers are never simple and they are never the same. Some men, eyes blazing with a bitterness that time has not softened, say no. They feel betrayed, used, and discarded. They speak of the lies, the hidden science, the pills pushed on them, the disability denials. They look at their broken bodies and their fractured families and see a swindle of epic proportions. They traded a lifetime of health for a brief moment of glory in a system that saw them as disposable. But others, often in the same breath as they describe their suffering, say yes, without hesitation. A former lineman, who can barely walk and carries a diagnosis of early-onset dementia, told me this. I knew it was hurting me. Even then I knew. But you have to understand what it gave me. It gave me a purpose my father never had. It gave my mother a house. It gave me brothers I would die for. It let me know, for one moment in my life, what it felt like to be great at something. The pain is the bill, and I'm still paying it. But I wouldn't return the experience if I could. This is the devastating duality at the heart of the scrapyard. The love for the game and the brotherhood is genuine, passionate, and eternal. The anger at the institution that exploited that love is equally genuine and profound. A man can hold both these truths in his heart, one in each ruined hand, every single day. The scrapyard is the final truth the NFL must face. It is the living, breathing, suffering evidence of the Industrial League's legacy. You cannot visit this place and see mere statistics or settlement claims. You see human beings navigating the consequences of a choice they made when they were too young to understand the full contract. They are proof that the machine's output, the championships, the highlights, the billions, had a direct and devastating input them. Their lives are the balance sheet. Their pain is the fine print. Their enduring love for the game is the complication that makes this story not one of simple victimhood, but of a tragic, beautiful, and costly bargain. And as I leave the scrapyard, as I listen to the quiet stories and the shared laughter that somehow still exists among the ruins, I am left with the final, unanswerable calculation. What is the acceptable human price for our Sunday entertainment? The men in the scrapyard have already paid it. The journey we have taken through the industrial history of the National Football League begins and ends in silence. It begins with the stunned quiet of a career's abrupt end, and it ends in the reflective, complicated quiet of hindsight. We have moved from the assembly line of the combine to the company town of team control, from the chemical toolbox to the foreman's whistle. We have walked the union floor, witnessed the medical denial, and traced the tragic arc of a broken prototype. We have seen the whistleblowers shatter the fortress walls, watched the litigation era force a financial reckoning, and observed the installation of new, safer machinery on the factory floor. We have finally lingered in the scrapyard, where the human cost of this century-long enterprise lives and breathes.
Nice one, buddy.
The arc is clear, from an unquestioned, celebrated industrial power to an institution forced into an imperfect, begrudging, and incomplete reckoning with the consequences of its own success. The central, enduring truth that emerges from this entire story is not one of simple condemnation, but of profound duality. The love for the game is real. The camaraderie is sacred. The pursuit of excellence within a violent, strategic, and beautiful framework is a pursuit that has meaning for the men who undertake it. This is not a fiction sold to them. It is a fire that burned within them long before the NFL ever stoked it. But equally real, and now undeniably documented, is the human cost. The broken bodies, the addicted systems, the shattered minds. This is not a story of a sport that is inherently evil. It is the story of an industry that, for generations, chose to prioritize its own growth and prosperity over the long-term well-being of the workforce that made that prosperity possible. The players loved the game. The institution exploited that love, often without providing the full truth of the bargain. So, we must ask the pivotal question of this modern era. Are the league's corrections, the protocols, the rule changes, the massive settlement evidence of genuine reform, or are they merely the most sophisticated form of reputational management yet? The answer, I believe, lies in the distinction between symptom and cause. The NFL has become admirably aggressive in treating the symptoms. It manages concussions better. It punishes the most egregious hits. It funds research and care for broken men. It has made the workplace safer in measurable, important ways. But has it changed the fundamental cause? Has it altered the core industrial logic that a player's physical capital is to be maximized over a short window, and that his long-term health is a secondary concern, a liability to be managed? The evidence suggests it has not. The economic structure remains. The player is still a depreciating asset on a balance sheet. The collective bargaining agreement still trades health concessions for financial gains, as the 17th game starkly proves. The culture, though less overtly brutal, still glorifies playing through pain and rewards availability over all else. The new machinery is more humane, but the factory's purpose is unchanged: to produce a violent, compelling spectacle for mass consumption. The reforms are real, but they are reforms to the process, not a reimagining of the product. The league is not in the business of preventing brain trauma. It is in the business of mitigating the legal, financial, and public relations risks associated with brain trauma. That is a crucial difference. It is the difference between a revolution and a retrofit. This leaves us, the audience, in a position of uncomfortable complicity. We are the consumers of this product. Our viewership, our passion, our Sunday rituals fund the entire enterprise. We celebrate the toughness we would never ask of our own sons. We revel in the highlight hits even as we wince. We are part of the ecosystem. To watch this sport, knowing what we now know, is to accept a degree of moral complexity. It is to acknowledge that our entertainment is derived from an activity that truncates and degrades lives. We can tell ourselves the players are compensated, that they choose this path, that the game is safer now. All of that is true. And yet, the men in the scrapyard are still there. Their pain is not erased by our justifications. Our complicity does not make us villains, but it does make us responsible for seeing the story clearly, for rejecting the league's mythology in favor of its more complicated and more human reality. Legacy is the final scoreboard. The NFL's legacy is assured as a cultural and economic titan, but its human legacy is a mosaic of glory and ruin. It is the legacy of unparalleled athletic achievement built upon a foundation of concealed damage. It is the legacy of brotherhood forged in a furnace of shared sacrifice and silent suffering. For the players, their legacy is split forever between the person they were on the field, powerful, celebrated, immortalized in film, and the person they became after, often aching, sometimes lost, always marked by the experience. There is no unified field theory that reconciles these two truths. They simply coexist, in tension, forever. As the lights go down on this examination, we are not left with a verdict, but with a weight. The weight of knowledge. The story of the NFL's Darkside is not a finished story. It is an ongoing tension between progress and profit, between safety and spectacle, between love and exploitation. The new generation of players steps onto the field with more information than any before them. They wear better armor. They are governed by stricter protocols. But they still step onto the same fundamental field of combat, where the core transaction, their physical sacrifice for our collective awe, remains essentially unchanged. The machine has been upgraded, but it still hums with the same powerful, seductive, and dangerous energy. Our task, having walked this long and shadowed path, is to watch with eyes wide open, to honor the glory without mythologizing it, and to remember that for every sunrise of a game day, there is a long, slow sunset being lived out in the quiet scrapyards of America, where the true price of our Sunday is patiently, painfully being paid.